Great individuals or a great group of people have the ability to shape history and mold it in their own image. They often have a kind of gravitas and charisma around which a great mass of people can unify. They are the very personification of a philosophy, a worldview, or of a system, with conviction and purpose, a kind of will to power around which people can mobilize. They amass a great following, and they embody the collective will of those people. However, oftentimes the legacy of a great individual is fractured after their death. With their passing, that unifying persona is fractured into many different inheritors who also inherit a part of that legacy, but not the whole. This is what I would term the fractured inheritance of a given legacy by a certain group of peoples, in that different individuals or different groups will inherit different aspects of a given legacy. And even if they were to inherit the same aspects of that legacy, their interpretations and understanding of it will be very, very different. The different legacies or aspects of these legacies that are inherited can compound over time, giving rise to new legacies or sub-legacies within the broader legacy. And in any case, when it comes to the inheritance of these different legacies or certain aspects of these legacies, these can be on an intellectual level. So these can be on a more theoretical, abstract level, or they can be on a very kind of practical, socio-political level. Whether it be in the realm of politics, or it be in the realm of intellectual endeavor, or spiritual practice, or philosophical worldview, these legacies that are often founded by these great individuals are fractured after their death and demise. For example, on a political level, we can see throughout history great leaders whose empires or whose dynasties were fractured after their deaths. For example, Alexander the Great, who without a doubt is one of the greatest leaders and generals of all time, having conquered most of the known world at his time. Yet his empire would fracture shortly after his death, and his generals would divide the spoils of his empire amongst themselves. In a similar vein, Qin Shi Huang, who was the first emperor of China, despite being a despot and a tyrant, he was without a doubt a great leader who managed to reunify Chinese civilization after an extensive period of infighting and civil war and different states vying for power. However, the Qin dynasty which he established inevitably collapsed after his death. This, of course, taps into the broader pattern that is present throughout Chinese history and Chinese civilization, that dynasties beginning with just rulers gradually fall into tyranny and despotism. This is the cycle of disintegration and reunification via unifying states that is constant throughout Chinese history. On a broader civilizational level, both on the political level and on the level of intellectual heritage and legacy, we can see that the legacy of the classical civilization or of the Greco-Roman was divided between the West, the Orthodox world, and Islamic civilizations respectively. Thus, the legacy of the Roman Empire was essentially inherited by these three as well. Of course, the Roman heritage may play a more important part in shaping the identity of one or two of these more than the other, but nevertheless, it still has played an important part in shaping these different civilizations and these different societies which have inherited the legacy of the Romans from the ashes of their decline and ultimate fall from grace. Similarly with the Eastern Romans, the Byzantines, who remained in power even after the Western Roman Empire had fallen, arguably their legacy was inherited by the Islamic and Orthodox worlds as well. Of course, with the Islamic inheritance of the Romans, they inherited a lot of the Greco-Roman canon, and they managed to preserve that Greco-Roman canon. In particular, the Muslims preserved a lot of the ancient Greek texts of philosophy and medicine, etc., etc., and they were brought back into Europe via the Muslims, right? After the Crusades, for example, they translated the Arabic translations of these works back into languages like Latin, which allowed for things like the Renaissance to occur. Of course, in terms of cultural legacy and in terms of cultural continuity and in terms of what you could say are the descendants, the civilizational descendants and the civilizational heirs of the Romans, I would say and consider them to be primarily the West. And obviously in terms of Eastern Europe, in terms of the Byzantines, that would be Eastern Europe, the Slavic Orthodox civilization as well. However, the Islamic civilization, whilst perhaps not being a kind of direct civilizational heir insofar as there isn't a sense of continuity between the two, but they certainly inherited parts of their legacy. And furthermore, the Muslims played a big part in preserving the intellectual heritage of that classical civilization, primarily in the form of preserving the works of the ancient Greeks. If we talk more broadly about the Islamic civilization, we can also talk about the Persian world or Persian civilization, which is an interesting case because, of course, Persian history itself is much more broader and older than just its Islamic component. But arguably, the Islamic world inherited part of its legacy. Of course, there are substantial differences between the Persian world after Islam and before Islam. There is no doubt about that. However, we can talk of the development of a distinctively Persian Islamic identity as well. And without a doubt, Islam has been a part of Persia's history, with many of the greatest scholars and thinkers of the Muslim world coming from Persia, coming from Iran. A similar case can be said about the Muslims of India, whereby the Indian Muslims are quite distinctively Indian in terms of their culture and in terms of their sort of way of life. It's a distinctively Indo-Islamic identity and history that they have, insofar as we talk about their history, whether it be the Mughals or whether it be Muslim resistance to Western colonialism, or even in terms of, compared to other Muslims, they do have a distinctively Indian flavor, so to speak, to their Islamic practice and identity. This also brings me on to a very important point. If we are to talk about Islamic identity and history, then naturally an important point in relation to the fracturing of legacy is that of the passing of the Prophet Muhammad and the fracturing of the Islamic tradition after his passing. Indeed, the passing of the Prophet, peace be upon him, was a sign, was a prerequisite condition for sectarianism to arise. And that is because the Prophet within his lifetime served as a unifying figure. Of course, at least for the vast majority of Muslims of that time, or for a vast majority, a vast number of them, the Prophet was a unifying figure, insofar as the Quran declared that if you dispute in something, then return it back to God and His Messenger. Without a doubt, the Prophet was a great man, whether or not people agree with the Islamic message or whether or not they like the Prophet or the religion he brought. There is no doubt that he is one of the great men of history who shaped countless generations of people with his teachings. He combined many roles within himself, such as that of a leader, a general, and a teacher, and this is upon the Semitic pattern of prophethood. The Semitic pattern of prophethood combined within it many different aspects, many different dimensions, including the socio-political, the spiritual, and the intellectual. Therefore, the inheritance of the Prophet, or what we could say the legacy of the Prophet, is quite important. One of my earliest videos, indeed actually my earliest video on this channel, is about the psychological and theological effects of the passing of the Prophet upon his community. Indeed, the passing of the Prophet was quite a psychologically traumatic event for his companions, and naturally, apart from the psychological effects, the theological ramifications are massive, in that there is no longer this unifying prophetic figure who can sort out the affairs of the Muslims. And on that basis alone, the legacy of the Prophet is fractured after his passing. Of course, initially we had the Rashidun Caliphate, where political authority was vested to the prophetic methodology. It was leadership based upon the model of the prophetic methodology, based upon the prophetic methodology. And this is why, when we talk about discussions of the Sunnah, discussions of the prophetic tradition, there are typically discussions also about following the example of the companions. But alongside that, there is also a discussion of following the representatives of the Prophet after him, aka the companions, and in particular of following the two first caliphs, Abu Bakr and Umar. This is of course as per the Sunni paradigm, or the orthodox Sunni paradigm at least. If you were to go to the paradigm of the Shi'as, obviously they would believe that the household of the Prophet is more entitled to the caliphate. First and foremost, as per most of the sects within Shia Islam, or most of the mainstream sects, first of all being vested within Ali, the son-in-law of the Prophet, peace be upon him and may God be pleased with him. But of course after him his sons and then their sons, for example. But nevertheless, whatever your perspective on this is, we see that the eventual civil strife, the fracturing that occurred within the Muslim community and the civil wars that occurred at the end of the Rashidun Caliphate led to the shift to kingdom and kings. So they went from leadership, political governance, from being upon the prophetic methodology to the gradual unraveling of it and the fracturing of that legacy, and what essentially became kingdoms and kings and empires and dynasties. Of course, there are hadiths, or there are prophetic traditions which give the meaning of the inheritors of the prophets are the scholars, or that the prophet's inheritance is knowledge. But indeed, amongst the companions themselves, there were those who did not combine all of the characteristics which the Prophet combined within himself. There were different archetypes amongst them. Some were warriors, some were leaders, some were scholars, some were businessmen, some were ascetics or mystics, etc., etc. This leads on to an important point, that schism and sectarianism are parts of the fracturing of any given legacy. And this isn't just the case for the Islamic faith, this is also the case for other faiths such as Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, or any other faith. Or even certain traditions within those faiths, or certain sects, or certain groups within those faith traditions. No longer will there be a unifying figure to return back to in case of a need for resolution. Of course, I have already mentioned the verse of the Quran that if you dispute in something, then return it back to God and His Messenger. But when the Messenger has passed, within whom rests that authority to resolve disputes? Could you get people to unite around said authority? Could it act as a unifying figure and principle? Even if you were to establish some supposed theoretical authority, could you get people to agree about it? Could you get people to agree about its authenticity, its veracity, its legitimacy? Could you get people to unite around it? Sectarianism often arises in many cases over which religious authority has to be followed, or over the lack of unifying authority, thus unifying interpretation. What should one follow? Should one follow some kind of tradition, some kind of sola scriptura Protestant approach, or should one just trust one's own instincts, or should one trust that the Spirit of God guides them whilst they are interpreting? What interpretation should one take exactly? Should one take a exoteric or esoteric interpretation? Should one take a literalist, a symbolic or a metaphorical interpretation? Should one take a scriptural or extra-scriptural interpretation? Are the full depths of the meanings of Scripture already revealed? Or will they be gradually realized over the course of time, over the course of the passage of time, as new knowledge is discovered and as the understanding of humanity evolves? Thus, we can see that there are an almost infinite amount of interpretations or perspectives of a tradition or of a system of thought or of a intellectual development that one can take. Yet the unifying presence of the great individual can settle such disputes, whether it be in the form of the prophet, the enlightened man, or the sage, or the great thinker. Without it, such legacy is fractured, leaving it to be interpreted and understood or acted upon differently. So we can see both in the socio-political case in the form of the great leader, or in the case of the great prophet with his faith tradition, or even in the case of the great philosopher with his philosophy or system of thought, that after their passing, that legacy can become fractured, both on an intellectual and on a political or socio-political level. Now, I'm going to take a slightly different turn here, and I would ask my viewers to forgive me if this is a bit of a sudden turn, as I've been talking about history and philosophy and politics up until this point, but I'm going to touch upon certain pieces of literature or certain stories, certain fictional stories, which I believe touch upon this theme quite well, because in many cases fiction or fictional stories teach you very well lessons which sometimes even history can't teach you. Of course, I do believe that history teaches us this lesson very well, but just to reinforce this point, I will make mention of certain stories. First of all, let's talk about Attack on Titan now. This is a story that I love to talk about over and over again, and I constantly go on about how good this story is. But there's a lot of interesting insights this story can give us into the fracturing of legacy. For example, the inherited will of a certain person is fractured into many different pieces to be inherited by different individuals. For example, within Attack on Titan, we have the case of Erwin Smith. Erwin Smith is the commander of the Survey Corps who, loses his life trying to win a battle for them, and it is only due to his brave sacrifice where he marches his soldiers into a death march, essentially, that they win the battle. But his legacy is fractured after his death. Erwin was a great leader who combined within him many different aspects that made him such a great individual, whether it be intelligence, curiosity, leadership, pragmatism, even idealism, and in fact he combined within himself at times many different, what you may consider quote-unquote contradictory aspects. But arguably that is what made him such a great leader, that he was able to combine all of these different aspects, all of these different characteristics of greatness within him. However, that legacy fractured after his death, and different characters inherited different aspects of that legacy. For example, Armin Arlet inherited his intelligence or his ingenuity. Hange inherited his curiosity, and Flock inherited his leadership or his ability to see past his humanity and his pragmatism and realism. We can also see in the main character Eren that his legacy was fractured as well between the Alliance, who inherited the desire for his loved ones to become heroes for all of mankind, and essentially the fact that he sacrificed everything so that they could attain this status, and the Jaegerists, who inherited the more nationalistic elements of his messaging, which was liberty for the Eldians at all costs, despite the fact that the rest of the world wanted to wipe them out, and his striving and fighting, for one's liberty, no matter the cost. In reality, Eren obviously is a complicated character, and it's not so simple as just he was fighting for liberty or he was forced to do this. A part of him wanted to do the rumbling for its own sake because he was disappointed of the existence of an outside world which hated him and his existence so much. In fact, the Survey Corps' legacy itself fractured as well between the humanistic, idealistic elements and the nationalistic, pragmatic or realist elements. And you can see a divide between the old guard, which is more humanistic and idealistic, and the new guard, which is more nationalistic and pragmatic in the form of the Jaegerists. You can see this between Levi's idealist vision of the Survey Corps versus the pragmatic vision of Flock. Flock asserts that we need our devils, or we need our devils, our evil ones, to do the necessary sacrifices, the things that are necessary for them to attain victory, because if we do not win, we will die. But for Levi, it was the case that the Survey Corps dreamed of a world which was free of tyranny, which was free of oppression, which was an idealistic and absurdly innocent world, free from titans, and where there was freedom for all of mankind. This also plays into Armin's vision versus Aaron's vision, which can be divided into a kind of positive liberty versus negative liberty divide. In other words, Armin wanted a kind of idealistic world, which essentially extended freedom for all of humanity, where if we just talked out our differences and attempted to understand one another, we could reach a peaceful resolution. But Aaron, on the other hand, understood that the outside world wanted their annihilation, and hence he saw that they could only win their liberty if all of their enemies were destroyed, aka the world outside the island, outside of the Eldians of the island. And Aaron's liberty came at the cost of depriving the rest of the world of their liberty and the right to life. And in a great irony perhaps, Aaron's vision of liberty essentially contradicted itself, such that Armin's vision of liberty essentially acted as a kind of answer or antidote or antithesis to Aaron's vision of liberty. But this fracturing is not just specific to the legacy of the Survey Corps. This is also replete throughout Attack on Titan. For example, the 9 Titans themselves, with each of them possessing a unique quality, is a fracturing of the legacy of Ymir, the founder Titan. And there's a kind of symbolism at play here, which is the biblical imagery of man being created in the image of God. Essentially, it's the imagery of the 9 Titans, the descendants of Ymir, are reflections of the image of the founder. Isn't it kind of ironic that the Eldian Empire considered Ymir to be a god? In other words, the 9 Titans who were her descendants were intelligent reflections of the original design. In any case, after the death of the founder Ymir, that legacy of intelligent Titans fractured into many parts. One of those parts turned out, at least in part, to be the antithesis, the very contradiction to the supposed hierarchy and authority of the founding Titan, and that would be the Attack Titan. The Attack Titan was always opposed to the self-righteousness of the king, as Grisha Jaeger put it. It was this constant striving for freedom which was in direct conflict and a direct antithesis to Ymir's obedience to King Fritz. One was a slave to hierarchy personified in the king due to her love for him despite all he put her through. The other is a slave to freedom, stopping at nothing to pursue it no matter the cost. After such fracturing, certain aspects of such legacies can transform or develop into the very antithesis, contradiction, or negation of what they may have initially or at first represented. And the best way to understand this lesson is indeed by the imagery painted in Attack on Titan regarding the Attack Titan, that the Attack Titan, although part of this legacy of intelligent Titans, turned out to be the antithesis, indeed the contradiction, of what the Titans, the intelligent Titans, the founding Titan originally was. And hence this aspect of this legacy of Titans developed or transformed into the very opposite or the very antithesis of what it may have initially set out to represent. There are various parallels where a certain thing, acts as a antithesis or as an answer or as a solution to something else throughout the story of AOT. Another example of this is the parallel between Mikasa and Ymir. Mikasa has a kind of parallel to Ymir insofar as the love that Mikasa has for her beloved Eren and the love that Ymir has for the king Fritz are at odds with one another. Mikasa has the love necessary to liberate her beloved from his suffering and put an end to the cycle of hate, whereas Ymir, her love is enslaving essentially, and it enslaves her so much that she continually obeys her oppressor despite having the ability to break free, thus continuing the cycle of hate. As such, Mikasa's conception of love or her acting upon her love acts as a direct antidote to Ymir's dilemma, insofar as we know that traumatized people or people in toxic or abusive relationships stay committed to them, unfortunately so. And this is exaggerated in the case of Ymir, where the king who literally went and pillaged her village and oppressed her, that king ends up becoming the object of her love and devotion and compassion, such that she willingly enslaves herself for 2,000 years to continually obey that king and continually make titans for the lineage of that king. Yet Mikasa's love demonstrates that one can liberate their beloved, that truly loving someone means breaking the cycle of hate that enslaves them, thus freeing these self-made devils, those who may have had a choice or may have had no choice to become these monsters, from the misery of the hell which they endure. The result of Mikasa's decision helped Ymir free herself from the cycle she had binded herself to due to her love. Hence there is a parallel between Mikasa's liberating love, which acts as an antidote to Ymir's enslaving or self-enslaving love rather. Thus, the big lesson to be taken away from Attack on Titan is that the fracturing of legacy allows for certain parts of that legacy to act as a solution or as an antidote to certain problems or certain issues within that broader legacy. Another anime or manga which is quite interesting is Kingdom, in that it discusses the inheriting of the wills of all those who have passed before us. In the context of Kingdom, it is based within the Chinese Wars of Unification, where China was unified by Qin Shi Huang to found the Qin dynasty, and it follows the story of a young boy called Xin, which is inspired by a real historical general of that time period, Li Xin, as he seeks to become the greatest general under heaven and earth. It discusses the idea that a general carries the weight of all those lives which have passed or which are still alive under them, and he carries the burden and weight of bearing their collective wills, their dreams, their desires, their ambitions, their secrets, whether they be dead or alive. These great individuals, these great generals, personify the collective will of the many. Indeed, they are its very embodiment. Now, some may critique this for falling into glorifying war, but there is an important point here. Shin, the main character in one of the later arcs, discusses that the nature of man is fire. This is the answer that he gives to the question of what exactly the nature of man is. Some say that it is inherently good, some say that it is inherently bad. But he breaks out of the common paradigms of thinking about things in terms of inherent good or inherent bad, in terms of mere morality. He is not thinking merely in these terms of good and evil, but more so in terms of the will to live and thrive. Thus, why he asserts that the nature of man is fire. This is reminiscent of the will as expounded upon by Schopenhauer, or the will to power as expounded upon by Nietzsche. In other words, it's about the will to struggle, to overcome, to survive, even if fate itself throws everything it has against oneself. Not only do these great individuals thus embody the will of that era, but they also embodied the very spirit of that era itself, and they embodied the collective spirit of the many. Yet at the same time, with the passing of time, with the passing of history, with the entering of a new era of history, somebody new, some new generation of great individuals will take their place. Thus the cycle continues. And this is something that General Oki touches upon in his death monologue, that one generation of great individuals will come and define an era of history, only for a new generation of great individuals to come along and replace them. And that is what makes these times so interesting. Hence, that cycle of history will continue where new great individuals will come and surpass the previous generation of great individuals, and they will set about defining their era of history. One of the great lessons that can be gained from Kingdom is that the legacy of these great individuals is oftentimes fractured and inherited by the many, who inherit it to the fire, quote unquote, of their own wills, which grows stronger with each added inheritance. And the will, the fire of will and the fire of life of each individual grows stronger as they inherit the various legacies of all those who came before them. In other words, it's the weight and burden of all those comrades that we have lived with, that we have abided with, that we have shared memories with, that give us strength to move forward. A final piece of literature that I would touch upon is A Series of Unfortunate Events. This is an interesting series because, primarily for me at least, it has quite an esoteric undertone to it. It discusses the existence of secret societies and of schisms within them. It talks of the existence of good faith, quote unquote, and quote unquote bad faith actors within these secret societies. It also discusses the hypocrisy of these supposed good guys, no matter how good their intentions are, and the short-term materialistic or hedonistic goals of the bad guys. It presents moral ambiguity and nuance, and even if one side may be better than the other, it does not mean that they are the absolute good guys, and indeed both sides can commit evil things as well. The esoteric undertones are quite interesting here, and to help us understand these further, I would like to borrow from a book called The Secret History of the World by Jonathan Black, in which he gives an esoteric perspective of human history. He discusses the existence of secret societies that guide the evolution of humanity's collective conscience. For example, he quotes from Steiner that the Archangel Michael, and this is just one of these esoteric beliefs, so this doesn't necessarily represent what I believe. I'm just putting that out there before anybody misunderstands why I'm quoting this. I'm just simply explaining one of these esoteric beliefs as an example, that the Archangel Michael has guided the evolution of humanity's conscience, or he has facilitated, he has helped out in the evolution of humanity's conscience rather, and it has led to the development of certain faculties which humanity did not always have, including individual free thought, free will, and the ability to choose freely whom we love. These faculties have gradually developed and evolved over time, and they have reached increasing levels of realization over time. However, within these secret esoteric societies, so to say, there have been schisms. For example, there have been the existence of factions such as the Illuminati, which are essentially materialistic, short-term centered or oriented factions that have infiltrated these secret societies and that have damaged their reputation with their sinister actions and intentions. They have ended up being, in many ways, the very antithesis or opposite of what these societies were supposed to be. In the case of the VFD, or the Voluntary Fire Department, in the case of the story, A Series of Unfortunate Events, which is a society that is supposed to put out both metaphorical and physical fires, quote unquote, but the opposite side of the schism ended up becoming the very antithesis or complete opposite of what this society set out to be. It ultimately led to its own downfall, and this is one of the great ironies of infighting and of schisms, that with the fracturing of said legacy, that such schisms and infighting that are caused by the fracturing of said legacy can lead to decline. It can lead to the downfall of any given group. This is most certainly the case because societies or groups of people or adherents of a certain faith are most powerful, are most cohesive, are most united when they are unified. But when they are disunited, it can be a signal of decline, as they do not agree upon the basic ideals which they should be pursuing, the basic points which they should believe in, or the basic ethos or spirit of what they should be striving for. Thus, the fracturing of legacy often leads to schism and division and sectarianism and infighting, which leads to decline. We can see this on a broader civilizational level if we are to talk about larger forms of social organization. For example, the age of crises with its infighting. For example, in certain civilizations, they will go through these age of crises, and there will be periods of time when these civilizations will experience infighting between the core states of that civilization. This is an idea that Dr. Carroll Quigley discusses in his work Tragedy and Hope, and in it he also mentions that civilizations usually come out of these age of crises when they are reorganized by a reunifying force which dissolves or seizes the previously existing conflicts between the core states of that civilization. We can thus see that the fracturing of legacy leads to schism and infighting, that the fractured inheritance of this legacy is interpreted and understood differently by its different inheritors, and how the fracturing of legacy leads to a lack of a unifying figure or authority or principle around which said group can unite itself around, and hence it leads to divisions, to arguments, to debates, to uncertainty even about the very essence of that group and of what it's supposed to stand for. And this can extend on both an intellectual level, a socio-political level, and on a more spiritual level. And these can have massive ramifications, whether they be the dissolution and the breaking up of a massive empire, whether they be the fracturing and schism of a certain philosophy or certain faith tradition or certain society, or whether it be bitter infighting between certain members of a given group. Thus, great individuals can rally around their own persona, many a people's, yet when they pass after their death, it usually leads to the fracturing of said group which they rallied around themselves.